Welcome to the next video on the conscious co-creation tools. We'll be diving a little more deeply this time, using the conscious co-creation tools not just as tools but as lenses for organization, and this connects through to the original video. And one thing that I said was that in the absence of intention, structure and process, or if they're misapplied, then all the manifestations tend to appear to be politics, personality and ego. So it's very important that we use the conscious co-creation tools as lenses for looking at organization as well. So in this video we're going to cover lenses, critical points and potential solutions. And this is what people want. They want this experience of holding hands and skipping through the flowers, but we need to be realistic about it, that often unexpected things pop up. And if we are viewing organization purely as relationships in emotional context, then what we often end up with is a little bit different, especially if we're not using the conscious co-creation tools as lenses to get to the underlying causes. So here are our starting points. Quotes from Deming again. And I like to emphasize that Deming is a fantastic guy, amazing philosopher, very, very deep intellectual and great spirit. And his contribution to systems thinking in terms of organization was vastly more than Buckminster Fuller in this area. And he was an absolute font of wisdom. And here we go. The big problems are where people don't realize they have one in the first place. And learning is not compulsory, neither is survival. And this one's from Moso. This is very important. Examples without theory teach nothing. And the word theory tends to turn people off. All it means is we have a prediction on the way things work and the way the outcomes will arise by pursuing that theory. So this is very practical stuff. The aims of the presentation are to share experiences and perspectives, to draw attention to critical issues and common errors, and to offer deeper insights using a lens of conscious co-creation, and to illustrate how things can and do go wrong, and the consequences, but also how we can apply these tools. And along the way, we'll highlight the key success or failure points and why the theory is vital. Because if we don't understand the tools that we're using, then the chances are we'll be interested in tampering with them. And then we get very different results. So we need to understand how and why they work. And I'll draw attention to the dangers of systemic aversions and the perception associated with that. And the sub-theme there is good people versus unwise decisions. So the key issues: personality and politics, or structure and process. What are we looking at? If we're using the lens of the conscious co-creation tools, we're always going to structure and process. If we've got structure and process, we've got a way of dealing with things. If we operate on the level of personality and politics, if we view things as personality and politics, all we're going to see is personality and politics, and all we're going to get is personality and politics. So what I've found is that when I do presentations on the conscious co-creation tools, people love them. They're so simple, they're so clear, so straightforward, and it's very easy for people to say yes, but not necessarily to understand, because don't forget, we're dealing with complete inversions of the way that most organizations work. And if people are going in blindly and not thinking about it, then it's very easy to forget about how the structure and the processes work. And a common denominator here is lack of questions. And if people are just saying yes, 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 and they don't have any questions, what if this happens? How do we deal with that? Then that tells me that assumptions are at work. And this is one of the key things for us to self-reflect on and reflect on as an organization. Because if we're using assumptions, we're using guesswork. And the next issue is lack of reflection. And that's aligned with lack of questions and using assumptions. And if we don't reflect on how the processes really work, and on a self and a group level, then we're not going to reach clarity. We're just going to be jumping from assumption to assumption. And if we have a lack of questions, which equals assumptions, and projections and programs, which is emotions, versus that focus on content and processes, then that's a problem. And we need to be able to use these tools for self-mastery, first of all, if we all own the processes, because the first line of application and defense of the system is for us to own the processes, so we really need to understand them. And one thing I've found is that professional situations are much simpler and much easier because people are coming in with professional attitudes. And we can contrast that to communities and voluntary groups, and there is a sub-theme here, which is very often a self-perception of we're different, we're better. And if that's the case, then we're projecting. I also need to underline the issue of tampering. That's what Deming called it. And if we've got a theory, then we can make prediction. We have a prediction of if we do this and this, then that is the outcome. If we have no theory, then we're opening up the door to what Deming called mindless copying. And we need to bear in mind, if we study this man, what we find is he's a very mild-mannered man. He's very deep, very thoughtful. It's like seeing your grandfather. So he was using powerful words here, and he was using that to emphasize the importance of this. And it really needs to be underlined that these are absolutely critical points. If we don't get this right, if we tamper, if we don't understand the theory, and if we start to mindlessly copy, then we're going to be getting the kind of results of the Mad Max movie instead of The Sound of Music. And the fact is, that's probably just completely the wrong way to look at it. So we'll also be covering potential solutions, because you can only lead your horses to water. People have to make their own mind up. But above all, the point here is that failure points are about a lack of focus on the system. So it's essential that we keep the focus on the system and the processes, and for that we need to understand them. And if we understand them, then we can absolutely embody the values and the processes. And that's really essential, because actually this isn't easy. It's about learning, and that's extremely important that we're open to that learning. So let's look at the key roles and assumptions. The first thing is, there we go, that the group embodies its values. It really has to think deeply about all of these things. Don't make assumptions. Always do your best. And it needs to embody the principles and the processes. It needs to think and understand exactly what happens in every situation. And it also needs to comprehend that the chair has the fallback position. If the group doesn't know or isn't doing its job, then it's the chair's job to bring that to the group, to return the focus to intention, structure, and processes. And for this to happen, I think realistically there needs to be an induction process, and it needs to be managed correctly. And this video is designed to help that induction process as well. Things need to be written down clearly so people understand. And I've come to the conclusion that actually it's quite important for people to be asked to sign that document, because then that really invites you to study what you're signing closely and to start to ask those questions. The other role that we have in the group is the counsellor mediator, and that is essential to be separate from the structural chair. And this needs to be someone who is highly skilled and experienced at this, and also who can embody the personal characteristics of having done their own personal processing. In my view, you can't have a counsellor mediator who is highly triggered or frequently triggered. You need someone who is basically pretty well never triggered, and who is really drawn to that particular role. And that's an absolutely vital role as well. The next role, if you recall, is the administrator. That's also very important because often people can't attend meetings or calls, and the discussions, the essence of them, needs to be recorded. And if people haven't attended meetings or calls, then the chances are that for whatever reason, it may be that they're disorganized, it may be that they're too busy, it may be that they've got a lot of things going on in their life, it may be they're not very structured, but the chances are they're not going to listen to the call recordings. So that person is either left behind, which is undesirable, or all of that communication needs to be repeated. So it's a major drag factor and this efficiency issue. So having an administrator to record the key items, key discussions, key points is very useful, and if that can be tied to a recording, then someone can go to that particular point to listen in detail. And this is something I've seen repeatedly in numbers of groups. So the administrator is a really key role. Another key principle is that the biggest group always makes the key decisions, and the specialists make domain recommendations. And we're going to go into that in this video and the next one. And the bottom line is that absolutely everyone needs to know their responsibilities and how and why the tools work. Because if not, we don't know what we're doing, or we're guessing. So as a reminder, the wisdom of the crowd and the collective consciousness means that the large groups consistently make better decisions than a small group or an individual. And that's predicated on the fact that they can have a reasonable discussion and a rational discussion on the structures and the processes. And it also needs to be diverse, which means it's got mathematical relevance. It also needs to be independent, decentralized, which means that you have the independent experts, so you're bringing in expertise, and you have the local knowledge, but you have expertise in context. And it's structured. And if the process works correctly, then you avoid mediocrity or mistakes by averaging the errors out. But you can't do that if you can't have a reasonable or rational conversation. So let's look at the fundamentals here. We've got a map. We've got a compass. That's our intention and our processes. And we've got the structure and the knowledge of how the structure works, which is that the bigger group always makes the decisions, the smaller group is always making recommendations. And ultimately that can grow into the flower of life. And if that's the case, and we have the specialist groups outside the core team, then they're making recommendations and we have a conversation about it in the core team. And there are reasons for this. And if we understand the theory, that we can understand how very powerful all of this is. So we have our navigating tools that we can bring to the situation, as well as our lenses to look at different situations. And we've got our processes to apply the collective consciousness, which are the circles: the energy circle, the listening circle, and the action learning circle. And then we've got our principles. And it's amazing how often all of these things go out the window when people start to deviate from the processes. So be impeccable with your word. And that would include, for example, that we're going to apply the conscious co-creation tools. And this is how they work. The next one: don't take anything personally. And I mean this. So it means, actually, this is a challenge. It's not that easy. Because add in the next one: don't make assumptions. And you might say, well, everyone makes assumptions all the time. But that's different from being aware of making assumptions. And the fact is that several assumptions could apply. So you don't know why someone is behaving in a certain way. And on that basis, you can change the design and the level of your questioning. It can be direct questioning, but it can also be neutral. It's not accusatory. And if we combine those two elements together, the emotional content, which is don't take anything personally and not making assumptions, then actually we're dealing with people's programs, because those are the manifestations of a program. And the next one is always do your best. And in fact, I would say if you're going to make any assumption, make an assumption that the other person or the other people are also doing their best. But here's an absolute killer. By all means be skeptical, but learn to listen. Because if we can't listen, we can't have that reasonable or rational conversation. So here are more about our team agreements. Take responsibility for yourself, for your actions, for your emotions, and for dealing with the team issues. And that means you've got to understand the processes, because a process only works if the team and the intention are supported. And we're talking about team decisions, not consensus, but we can try more than one option. And as a reminder, this isn't we make a decision and that's it, it's stuck. There are ways that we can go back to address issues, and we should address issues if someone believes that Houston, we have a problem. So on that basis, we've also got a methodology and a structure and a process for dealing with conflict and non-violent communication. How easy it is to slip out of this. But it helps if you're keeping the focus on structures and processes and not on you're acting like a whatever. And underlining this is a real requirement to be able to have real, honest and open communication versus projection. And we're into projection the moment we're into assumptions plus emotions. And ultimately, if we can start to do this, then we can really participate in self-reflection and self-mastery versus command and control. Because ultimately, what we're agreeing to is to surrender our ego to the process. So, if we put all these things together, we have ways to deal with conflicts in values, both group and personal. And it's all very well saying yes, yes, yes to all of this stuff, but we get conflicts between values, even these values, in the situations we deal with in these groups. And the first thing we need to do is to be aware that we've got conflicting values, and then make decisions on what is the best thing to do in that situation. Because people are not straightforward. So it's easy, isn't it? And the answer is no. We've got these conflicting values, and this is where doing the work on the Myersbriggs and the 5 aspects for our self-reflection becomes really important. One thing I learned that was very profound was, hang on a second, there's a scale here between truthfulness on the one hand and agreeableness on the other hand. How do we navigate that? And my insight was, well, I've been very truthful in the past, but I've used truth as a weapon to beat people. And so it was attached to emotional content. And equally, I've been very agreeable, but I haven't really agreed, and I've not been truthful. And this is where, if you deal with a politician or a diplomat, they're going to be very, very agreeable, maybe your bank manager, but they're not going to necessarily give you what you want. They could be giving you smiles and nods and agreement, and absolutely be disagreeing with you. So, where's the synthesis of these points? The synthesis of these points for me is that if you can convey your truth without the emotions coming in, if you can maintain a position of observing yourself, of being neutral and talking about the structure and the process issues, you can share your truth. And that's not to say that other people won't be triggered by it, but if you can convey things in that way, then their response to it is their program, not yours. But you need to be honest with yourself to be able to do that and to convey your truth in a very straightforward and neutral manner. So we need to also consider different personality types, the people to whom feelings and emotions and relationships are everything. And the fact that actually what we've agreed to here is structures and processes. And it's very easy to have the structure and the process of the group bent around somebody's triggers, someone's programs when they're off on an emotional stampede. And we also need to make some space for different communication styles, because that's another one. How can someone who is making their decisions on what's right, what's the right thing to do, and what is doing it in the right way, communicate or be understood by someone who is all about emotions and how they feel and how other people feel and things like that. So we need to have some concept of making space for people with different personalities and different communication styles. And the next one is blind spots, because we all have them. And if we're not prepared to listen and understand the theory behind what other people are saying, then we're just going to assume our way over our blind spots. But if we really listen, then we can find the gold that other people are bringing to the table. Because if it's in my blind spot, I can't see it. It's not even in my conceptual framework. We'll cover some of this in this presentation. The next one is the assumptions. As I said, it's hard not to bring assumptions to the table, but I think we should have a recognition that there are all sorts of different assumptions that can apply in a situation, and we can choose not to assume them, and instead we can deal with structure and process. The next thing is projections, programs, and judgments. So judgments in this case not being about reflection and perception and discernment, but about condemnation. So, and all of those things indicate a focus on personality and communication styles, not processes, not on understanding and learning. And the final one is, hey, be skeptical but learn to listen. And if we can't learn to listen, then what is the risk of shooting the messenger? That's the norm. That's what usually happens. So real world issues we have to deal with include assumptions, and that's indicated by a lack of open and neutral questions. It is, okay, that all looks okay to me. And if we combine that assumption with emotional responses, then we have projections and programs going on. And very often when that happens, the people are thinking in terms of archetypes. The victim, the oppressor, the saviour. And if we can be aware that we're thinking in those terms, then we can be aware that actually we're thinking in terms of archetypes. And that means there's a program going on. And that's not us. But we can decide to let it run us or not. And we can't if we're not aware of it. So here are our solutions. We keep our focus on intention, structure and process, not personality or communication style. We apply the processes. And we support the chair in applying the processes because they're the last line of defence. If the team has forgotten or misunderstood its processes, then there is no chance for a group if the chair can't bring the processes back to the group and the group back to the processes. And that's their job. And in doing so, that is always putting them in the hot seat for projections. Every single situation that I've encountered over 23 years of using these tools has always resulted in projections when I have brought people back to the processes. Just be aware of that. And I'm going to ask you to consider that you're in the role of the chair for this video. So we also need to consider individual processes, which is if you're triggered, recognize it. Take responsibility. Remember, take responsibility for your emotions and be proactive. And if you're proactive, then it's not just about, hey, haha, I was triggered and walking away from it. You need to approach the person who triggered you and discuss it with them. And I think you'll find that if people do that, then you get an immense amount of respect from the other person, having the humbleness to say, I was triggered. I'm very sorry. Can I discuss it with you? And if they don't approach you, you can approach them. And we have another line of defense here because obviously that's not easy stuff. And the next line of defense is to use the group mediator and counsellor, who absolutely has to be a person who is fully grounded, who's done their work and is not prone to running off on their own programs, because if not, how can you listen to someone? How can they have credibility if they are the most triggered person in the group? how can they be the mediator and counsellor, giving you neutral, good advice when they're not a shining example of it themselves? And the fallback position is to take it to the group. So let's consider this. If we've got two people who are at each other's throats, then the first thing is that the person who's triggered needs to take it to the other person. The other person who's not triggered needs to propose a call with them. Let's say that they don't call. Then you can use the group mediator or counsellor if you have one. And the final choice is to take it to the group. And here's the penalty for inversion, and it happens so often. So the key failure points are the projections. You're a such and such. Instead of process, we have personality. The next one is failure to support the processes. And how can that happen if you don't understand the theory? And you can predict the outcomes from the theory. And you therefore recognise the absolutely vital importance of all of this, because all of it has been used. All of it has been thought out. All of it has been tested rigorously. Here's another key failure point, which is the mediator or counsellor who is personally unsuited to the job, which means they're triggered or they're not doing their job. Here's the next one. What if the chair isn't focusing on structure and process? And what if they're making or taking things personally? Well, they're not up to their job either. Do you see how difficult this is now? What a challenge it is. So here's the next one. The team members taking things personally instead of focusing on structure and process. And the final one is making assumptions and not listening. How can you communicate with someone and have a reasonable conversation if they're not listening? You can't. We also need to consider some toxic behaviours, which is, okay, I read the processes, but they don't apply to me, they apply to other people, or they don't apply to this situation. Surely they apply to every situation. Another unwise behaviour is repeating conversations to the group with imprecision, which means that if we do that, and it's unavoidable in some situations, but we really need to be trying to bring a great deal of discernment to this, which is bringing in the context and the nuance of that conversation. Because if not, it can look very Machiavellian. But let's go to the assumption there. It might not be. It might just be that that person was looking through a lens of emotion, of personality, etc., and they just picked out certain elements and missed the context and the nuance. What I'm suggesting is we need to bring a great deal of thought and discretion about doing things like that, and a great deal of care. Because if not, we're doing someone else a disservice, and in fact, if it's found out that we do things like that, then that really damages people's confidence in us, in our judgment. So the next one is projections, which is no questions or weaponized questions, because they exist as well. That's where you add the emotion and the emotional content. Those are projections. The next one is spiritual superiority, which is the subtle languaging of I'm right, or you're wrong, or you're an idiot. And that includes things like labelling. And I think we need to use, again, extraordinary discernment about this, because if we label things or people as old paradigm, division, separation, then what we're doing is we're using spirituality as a stick to measure people and ultimately to hit them with. And isn't that old paradigm, division and separation? So for me personally, when I talk about spiritual aspects of life, I don't do it very much, but I talk in the abstract, I talk in the general, and I talk about how I use it and how it applies to me. There's a very fine line of discernment in applying things to measure, judge, and belittle other people. And that to me is a super toxic behaviour. It is the last bastion of ego, and there's really nothing you can do with it. Nothing you can do about it. when someone is conveying those sorts of values. The next one is righteous wrath, which is someone who's been saving their program for a number of days instead of processing it and building up their projection upon someone else. And we need to really, I think, do some good thinking about these issues of truthfulness versus agreeableness. What's the difference? Because if you're heavily into agreeableness, it may be that whenever someone honours you with their truthfulness, then you're going to see it as disagreeable. And immediately they're a bastard or whatever. So what's the difference? How do we navigate that? And I think I covered that previously. Here's an example. So in the first group that we operated the conscious co-creation tools in 23 years or so ago, a company kept on sending 3 people to the meeting, and they quickly realised they couldn't influence me as the chair. I was there to serve the group, and the group was making the decisions. They were coming with a commercial agenda, and something very interesting happened. Those 3 people quickly put aside the commercial agenda and then continued to come to the meetings and were magnificent. Actually, it's a great compliment to them and to their company that they were so committed, and they kept on sending these 3 brilliant people who could completely put away that corporate agenda. The bottom line is this: if you want to take over a group, then you've got to stack it. And once people become aware of the obviousness of the stacking, then they can bring more people to the group as well. So there is a natural process of countering infiltration within the conscious co-creation tools. Now, I'm going to present you with some problems as the chair of the group, because how are you going to know the processes unless you look through the lens? I was in one group that I was chairing many years ago, and I was in another group, and there was a little bit of overlap between the 2 groups, and one person was in the other group also. And the chair of that group got in touch with me and said there has been an allegation of sexual impropriety against this person who was in both groups. And we're going to need to deal with that. And I'd like to add a complicating factor here, which is that both groups were dealing with paradigm-changing technologies, and on that basis, it is quite a well-known tactic to try and destroy people's reputations. So it wasn't necessarily true, but nevertheless, having people involved in the other group, they wanted to have a discussion about it, they wanted to have clarity about it, and they wanted to make their decisions. So there was some overlap between the 2 groups, and there were 2 very different potential issues to deal with. One was I was a group member, and the other one, I was the chair. So we had the discussion in the other group, and the decision was taken, and I was the chair of the first group. And you know what's going to happen in this situation. If you take it to the group, then you're the messenger, and you're going to get shot for it. Even though I was the person who actually was defending that person in the other group, I had my own duty to take care of. So shooting the messenger was an inevitable byproduct of that. What I would rather have happened would be that that person had taken the issue to the group and said, look, I've got a problem. This has been happening. I want to share it with you because I'm aware that it may impact how you perceive me. It may impact other people's perception of the group. It may impact their perception of people who have professional interests alongside the group as well, to have association with me. So I want you to consider what you would do in that situation as the chair of the group. So now pause the video and just have a think about how you'd handle this situation. So in the absence of that person taking the initiative and taking it to the group, I, as the chair who'd been defending that person on the other group, now had to take it to the group that I chaired. And we had a good conversation, and the group took a brave decision, which was, okay, they can stay with us. But there were repercussions, and one was that one of the founder members now didn't wish to share information with that person. And in fact, they were insisting on a signed legal agreement. So you're the chair. What are you going to do about it? Pause the video again and have a think. Sometime down the line, there was a personality clash between two other members of the group. And in fact, what that led to was catty comments overflowing into the group chats. And that's absolutely against our intention. It was against our processes, etc. So again, you're the chair. What do you do? Pause the video and have a think about it. Well, the process was this, that the person who was most triggered should have been approaching the other person, but they didn't. And when I spoke to the other person about it, they said that they had tried to speak to them, but they'd refused to talk, and they in fact believed it would just cause a power game. Now, I could quite believe that, but I could also believe that actually that person might have been playing politics with the situation. But we've got a process, and effectively neither of those people are abiding by the process. So you're the chair. What do you do? So I talked to both of the people, and both of the people then refused to talk with a mediator. And in fact, interestingly to me, they were both therapists also. It was interesting how often I've seen that the therapists are the most triggered people in these groups. Not always, of course, but often. So we've got our second line of process now, which is being bypassed by both of these people. You're the chair. What are you going to do? The person who may have been playing politics by saying that they'd already tried to speak to person A and they felt that it would just cause a power grab, then copied the group in on a private email conversation with another member of the group in which the subject matter was your performance as the chair in resolving the matter. So you're the chair. What are you going to do? What I did in that situation was ignore it. There's a time to intervene and there's a time not to. And when things are getting hot and there is a lot of political behaviour going on, then you need to also assess whether you're going to be supported by the group. So I just ignored that one. That was my call, and that's what I did at the time. The next rollout of this particular issue was that I then said, okay, well, our final process is to do a listening circle. And what I found was that person A, who was the most triggered person, outright refused to do a listening circle. And in fact, person B left the group. So you're the chair. What are you going to do? Well, effectively, what this means is that now the processes themselves are being challenged. And what I found was that because of the predominant focus on emotions and relationships, no one in the group was supporting me as the chair in applying those processes. And in fact, as often happens in this situation, because it's all being perceived as personality issues, what I found was that a small group of the founders was coalescing around person A, who was also a founder member. And in fact, the bottom line on this was that they were insisting on special treatment for them, which was actually not just against the processes, which everyone had agreed, but it was actually against the legal structure of the constitution of the organisation. So you're the chair. What are you going to do? What I did was I explained that what was proposed was against the legal structure of the Constitution, and that we had processes and that they weren't being followed. And what I proposed was that if there was any problem with the processes, because there must be if they weren't being applied, then everyone should read the processes again. And if they had any amendments or suggestions regarding the processes and better suggestions, then we can discuss them. And that's exactly what happened. And it resulted in no input, even from person A, who is refusing to apply them. So person A is still refusing to apply them. You're the chair. What are you going to do? Well, because the group now was effectively being bent around one person's projections and emotions, and they'd moved from person B to the chair and to the processes, then what I suggested was, okay, we're going to go through every single word of the processes, and we did do over weeks, if not months. And again, the emphasis was, if you have any amendments or suggestions regarding the processes, we'll discuss them, the group can decide them, and we can implement them. And that, in fact, resulted in no input. Even person A said, they're great, they're perfect. But person A was still refusing to apply them, still refusing to do a listening circle. So you're the chair. What are you going to do? Well, what I did in this situation was to talk with the other members and suggest that we should have a signed agreement. And at that point, that person decided, I'm not going to sign the agreement. Everyone else decided they'd had enough of it and they were going to sign the agreement, and that person left. So what are my lessons and observations from this? The first one is it's very easy actually to get a group twisted around someone's programs and triggers and emotional stuff. And it takes a certain amount of strength of character to support the processes and the team agreements. But it was absolutely essential that the processes and the team agreements should be applied from the outset. And if we'd done that, and if there had been support for them, for the intention of the group and for the chair, then a lot of that time wasting, a lot of that stress would have been completely eliminated. It would be quite clear. Listen, it's clear. Here are our processes. You're not doing them. You either have to agree them, in which case you do them, or you've got to go. I'm very sorry, but that's what we've agreed. My other observation was that the group itself was being triggered emotionally and effectively paralysed by it, unable or unwilling to take action to support their processes, and quite happy to see their own time and everyone else's time dragged out by one person completely in their ego. So the group was effectively abandoning its processes and its structure at that stage to dance around someone's emotional programs. My next reflection is that it's a challenge. It's a challenge to maintain a position of neutrality, and exceptionally so if the group doesn't recognise the role and the key import of their processes and the chair in supporting them. And if you're not supported as the chair, you've either got to drag people through a long process like I did, or what are you going to do? It's a group organisation. It's team rules. You've got a choice. If it's not working, you can leave. And my next observation is that the two protagonists in this exercise were both therapists, and therefore to be careful about who acts as the group mediator and counsellor. They need to have great capacity, both on a professional level and on a personal level. If they're triggered or in their programs, they're not going to be able to do their job. And that's not my job, and it absolutely should not be an overlap with the chair of the group either, because the chair is inevitably the source of projections when people are viewing things in terms of personality and politics. And your job is to take people back to structure and process. So The whole thing had to rely on total focus on the processes only to remain out of the personality, politics and ego arena. That took a lot of time, a lot of dedication, a lot of patience. But nevertheless, the process was damaging. It sucked the energy out of the group, but it was valuable learning experience. So the bottom line is, could the outcome have been better? Yes, if the group had chosen to see the importance of its processes and to apply its processes immediately, equally and fairly, and support the chair in applying them. Here are our focus points again, the Toltec principles. Be impeccable with your word. And above all, in this case it means stick to your agreements. Apply the processes, at least try them. Don't take anything personally. And you've got to embody this if you're the chair. Don't make assumptions. Always do your best. And if you assume anything, assume everyone else does too. Be skeptical, but learn to listen and take responsibility for yourself, your actions, your emotions, and for dealing with the team issues, because the process only works if it, the team, the chair, and the intention are supported. Other focus points: beware of interpretation, which is projection, because you can't know how others think or feel, or how they rationalize things, ever. You can only guess or project your own thoughts and feelings on someone else. That's probably worth considering very deeply. You can't know. And the assumption that everyone thinks the same or everyone feels the same is complete rubbish. So you can't guess. Take responsibility for yourself, your actions and emotions, etc. Think very carefully if you wish to tamper with the system, the structure or the processes. And most people don't. And understand the difference between judgment as discernment and judgment as condemnation. And choose what you're going to apply for yourself. So the potential breaking points of the conscious co-creation tools are that the group, its members, do not know the importance of their self-organization system. They don't understand it. They don't use it as a lens, keeping their focus on structure and process, and as a result, they don't take responsibility for applying it. And if that doesn't happen, then the chair is the fallback position, and they need to be supported. So the next one is that the chair doesn't know their job of intention, structures and processes, or they're unstable, or they're unable to be neutral. The next one is because the mediator could have stepped in. The mediator counsellor doesn't do their job or is unsuited to it, which means they're triggered, they're projecting and unable to be neutral. And the result is that discussion of structures and processes is moved to personality projections. And they are frequently, I would say always actually, focused on the chair, because it's your job to go, hey, we've got processes. And the last one is no questions. We avoid reasonable and rational discussion if we've got no questions, because we're operating purely on assumptions. So remember, we have choices. Our feelings do not and should not depend on other people. This is classic program stuff. So why be offended? What you think of me is none of my business. We need to take ownership of this stuff and understand that very often our feelings are coming from programs. No one knows what other people are thinking, and that means you've got to ask and not guess. We can only do our best, and it's best to assume nothing or that people are doing their best. And ultimately, when it comes to intention, structure and processes, consider the consequences of losing your map and compass or tampering with the system when you've never used it properly in the first place. Consider the basis of our decision making as well. Is it on dancing around people's emotions? Or is it about what's the right thing to do? And then, secondly, what is doing it in the right way? If we're thinking about a group, then we need to be operating on principles and not dancing around programs. So in conclusion, it's vital. It's absolutely vital to focus on intention, structure and process, not personality and behaviorism. Behaviorism is where you try and influence someone else's behavior, but you can't. All we can do is to create an environment where we're encouraging the best behavior possible. And that means we've got to support the structure and processes. I can't resolve someone else's problems or their programs for them. Only they can do that. Behaviorism is the root of all communism and fascism. So we need to recognize the importance of these items and to understand how they work, which is the theory. We need to know our responsibilities to the team and its structure and processes. And we need to understand the potential consequences of getting things wrong or inverted. Because if we don't, then at the very least it's going to cost us a lot of time. And if we're viewing the world in terms of emotion, programs, projections and archetypes, guess what? That's exactly what we're going to get. So the lens that we use becomes critical. And in fact, what I'm suggesting is that the Sound of Music lens is also the Mad Max lens. It's exactly the same coin. It's about emotions, not processes. So the lens is critical. The indicators of using the wrong lens are the perceptions in archetypes, the oppressor, the victim and the saviour. You're spoiling our reality, which is personalizations. The lack of neutral system and process focused questions, which means assumptions, which means emotional content. How do we assess the values or the efficacy of an organisation? Surely it's about the questions that are not allowed to be asked. If you want to go further, I'd refer you to MOSO, the Model of Sustainable Organisation, the free resources, the book, the digest and the notes, the YouTube introductory video, and you can look up Dr. W. Edwards Deming, Systems Thinking. As Buckminster Fuller said, you'll never change things by fighting the existing reality. I think I'd add, you'll never change things if you look at things in the same way as you've always looked at them. Thank you for watching.